The phone rang at 3:17 in the morning, and Nora Keller knew before she picked it up that something had broken in the world she had left behind. She was sitting in the kitchen of her apartment in Portland, Oregon, 400 miles from the town she had grown up in, 11 years from the last time she had spoken a full sentence to her father. The coffee in front of her was cold. It had been cold for 2 hours. She had poured it at midnight when the insomnia started again, the same insomnia that had been following her for weeks, like a stray dog that would not be shooed away no matter how many times she turned off the light and closed her eyes and told herself that tomorrow would be different. The phone buzzed on the counter and the screen lit up with a number she had not saved but recognized anyway. Recognized the way you recognize handwriting on an envelope from your childhood home, not because you have memorized it, but because it is stored somewhere deeper than memory, somewhere in the machinery of the body itself where the important things live, whether you want them to or not. She picked it up. She said nothing. She waited. The voice on the other end belonged to Slade Donovan. She knew that voice, the way you know the sound of a church bell from the town you grew up in, a sound that has nothing to do with the present moment, but carries the weight of every moment that came before it. Deep, unhurried. The kind of voice that does not waste words because every word it has ever spent has cost somebody something real. Slade Donovan was the president of her father's motorcycle club. He had been at her mother's funeral 11 years ago. He had stood in the back row in a leather vest with patches on the front, and he had not said a word to anyone, and he had been the last to leave the cemetery standing alone at the gate with his hands in his pockets and his head bowed while Nora drove away without looking back. "Nora," he said, "your father went up the mountain tonight. He was supposed to visit a friend up there. He did not come back. His dog just came through the back door of our meeting place about 20 minutes ago, and the dog is torn open. Half his ribs are showing on one side. He has been shot. He has been beaten. But he walked in here on his own legs, and he had a piece of another man's vest clamped in his teeth. The vest belongs to a man named Dax Riggs. Dax Riggs has been trying to kill your father for 3 weeks. We are going up after your father right now. I thought you should know before we left." She said nothing for a long time. She held the phone against her ear, and she stared at the kitchen wall, and she felt something move inside her chest that she had spent 11 years building walls around. She had built those walls carefully and methodically, the way a person builds a dam across a river, one stone at a time, each stone placed precisely to hold back the water that would destroy everything downstream if it ever got through. The walls had held for 11 years. They had held through holidays she spent alone in this apartment with the television on and the sound turned down. They had held through birthdays when she picked up the phone and stared at the number and put the phone down again. They had held through the quiet moments at 2 in the morning when she would wake from a dream in which her father was standing in the doorway of his shop, not moving, not speaking, just standing there with the dog beside him. And she would lie in the dark and press her fist against her sternum and breathe until the feeling passed. The walls did not hold now. The water came through. It came through the way water always comes through when a dam finally breaks. Not slowly, not politely, not one drip at a time, but all at once, carrying everything with it. 11 years of silence and stubbornness, and the particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone who is still alive, and knowing that the losing was your choice, and that choices are supposed to mean something, but sometimes they just mean you are alone. "How bad?" she said. Slade was quiet for a moment. The silence on the line had the quality of a man choosing his words with the care of a surgeon choosing instruments. Then he said, "The dog walked 11 miles to get to us, Nora. He came down off that mountain in a straight line through the woods, and he hit the screen door of the cigar bar at a full run, and he went down on the floor, and he could not get back up. He had a piece of that man's vest in his teeth, and he would not let go of it. That tells me 2 things. It tells me your father is alive or was alive when the dog left him. And it tells me that whoever did this to the dog got worse than what they gave. I am coming, Nora said. She hung up the phone. She stood in her kitchen for 90 seconds without moving. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the microwave blinked. The cold coffee sat on the counter reflecting the overhead light in a small dark circle that looked like an eye. Then she picked up her keys. She walked out of her apartment without locking the door behind her. She got into her truck and turned the engine over and pulled out of the parking lot and pointed the hood south and drove into the dark toward a life she had sworn on her mother's grave she would never go back to. 400 miles. She would make it in 6 hours if she did not stop. Now let me tell you about the man she was driving toward and the dog that had already saved him once that night and was about to save him again. Gunnar Steele was 64 years old. He had a silver beard that hung to the middle of his chest, thick and wiry. The kind of beard a man grows not because he is making a fashion statement, but because he stopped caring about fashion statements somewhere around the same year he stopped caring about what strangers thought of him, which was roughly the same year he turned 40 and realized that the opinions of people who did not know him were about as useful to his life as a screen door on a submarine. His forearms were wrapped in tattoo ink, so old it had faded from black to the blue-gray of a winter sky. Just before the snow comes images and words and symbols that told the story of his 20s and 30s in a language that only men who had lived a similar life could read. He moved slower now than he had 2 decades ago. His left knee popped every morning when he stood up from the cot in the back room of his shop, a sound like a small dry branch breaking underfoot. His right shoulder ached when the weather turned cold, a souvenir from a fight he had been in 20 years ago that he never discussed because the other man had come out of it worse, and discussing it would have been the kind of boasting that Gunnar considered beneath the dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. But his hands still knew an engine the way a concert pianist knows a keyboard by feel, by memory, by the kind of love that does not need to explain itself, because explanation would only diminish it. He had been a member of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club for 22 years. He was the sergeant at arms, a title that sounds like it belongs on a plaque in a government building, but in the world Gunnar inhabited meant something entirely different. It meant that when something inside the chapter needed to be handled, Gunnar handled it. Quietly, permanently, without paperwork, without witnesses, without the kind of loose ends that come back around in 5 years and ask questions that nobody wants to answer. He had earned the position not by being the largest man in the room, though he was large, not by being the most dangerous, though he had been dangerous when danger was what the situation called for, but by being the most reliable human being any of those men had ever known. In a world where a man's word was the only currency that held its value, Gunnar Steele's word was gold standard, backed by 22 years of doing exactly what he said he would do every single time, no more and no less. His shop sat at the end of a gravel road on the outskirts of a town in northern Nevada that most maps had decided was not worth the ink. The town had a gas station with 2 pumps and a handwritten sign that said, "Pay inside." It had a diner called Rose's that served coffee strong enough to strip paint and pie good enough to make you forget it. It had a hardware store that was open 3 days a week and closed on the other 4 for reasons the owner had never explained and no one had ever asked about. And it had a cigar bar called Mercer's that served as the unofficial meeting place for the local chapter of the Iron Wolves, a bar with dark wood walls and a ceiling fan that had been turning at the same speed since the year it was installed, and a back room with a heavy door that was closed on Wednesday nights when the chapter met to discuss things that the rest of the world pretended did not exist. The shop itself was a cinder block rectangle with a corrugated steel roof that pinged in the rain and 2 bay doors that Gunnar kept open in the summer to let the desert air through and closed in the winter to keep the desert air out. The floors were stained concrete. The workbench was 16 feet long and had been built by Gunnar himself out of reclaimed railroad ties and 1/4-inch steel plate. The tools were organized with a precision that bordered on the religious, each wrench and socket and screwdriver in its designated spot on the pegboard, each spot outlined in black marker so that any tool out of place was visible from across the room. This was not obsessive behavior. This was a man who understood that in a shop where the work mattered, knowing where your tools are is not a preference, but a discipline. The same way a surgeon knows where the scalpels are, and a soldier knows where the ammunition is. And in a patch of sun near the bay door, lying on the warm concrete, with his chin on his paws and one ear rotated toward the road, was the dog. His name was Ranger. Belgian Malinois. Black mask over a face that was all angles and alertness, the kind of face that looks like it was designed by an engineer who was given a single specification sheet that read, "Build me the perfect machine for paying attention," and then decided to wrap the result in 70 pounds of muscle and fur. The body was lean and dense, the kind of lean that comes not from deprivation, but from a metabolism that converts everything into readiness, every calorie burned in service of a machine that can be sleeping on a concrete floor 1 second and 30 feet away with its teeth in something the next second. The transition between those two states was so fast that the human eye could not reliably track it. You saw the dog lying down. Then you saw the dog arriving somewhere. The middle part simply did not register. Ranger had scars. A long one across his left shoulder, a raised white line that ran from the point of the shoulder blade down nearly to the elbow, the kind of scar a knife leaves when it is drawn through muscle with intent. A notch in his right ear where a bullet had taken a crescent-shaped piece of cartilage smooth and pale against the darker fur around it, a permanent monument to a moment when the distance between alive and dead had been measured in fractions of an inch, and the measurement had come back favorable by the slimmest possible margin. And inside the flap of that same ear, faded but still legible, if you had the knowledge to look and the nerve to lift a Belgian Malinois ear, to check was a tattoo, a service number, 5 digits and 2 letters that told a story the dog could not tell in words, but carried in his body every day of his life. Ranger had spent the first 4 years of his life as a police K9 in a state that Gunner would not name out loud, not because naming it would cause trouble, but because not naming it was his way of honoring the privacy of men who had served alongside the dog and who deserved to be left alone. The handler had been a man whose name Gunner also did not say, not out of disrespect, but out of a kind of reverence for the dead that certain men carry, the way others carry photographs or rosary beads, or the memory of a face they saw in a particular light on a particular day and have never been able to forget. The handler had been killed during a stairwell raid in a housing project on the east side of a city that made the national news for one night and was forgotten by the next morning's news cycle. He was shot twice going through a door that he should not have been the first one through, but was because someone above him had made a decision, and someone below him had followed the order, and the door was the place where those two facts converged into a consequence. Ranger had been beside him when he went down, not behind him, beside him. The dog had entered the stairwell at the handler's left hip, which is where a K9 runs when the handler is right-handed, and when the handler fell, the dog did not run and did not retreat and did not do any of the things that a living creature is supposed to do when the sound of gunfire fills a concrete stairwell and the person you are standing next to is no longer standing. Ranger lay across the handler's chest. He lay there for 4 hours. He growled at anyone who approached, including the paramedics who needed to access the body, including the other officers who wanted to clear the scene, including the department chaplain who had been called to say words over a man who was already past the point where words could change anything. The dog would not move. He would not be coaxed. He would not be bribed with food or water or the soft voice that handlers use when they need an animal to stand down. He lay on that man's chest in that stairwell, and he waited for the man to get up, because in the simple operating system that ran behind those dark eyes, the man always got up. The man, had always gotten up before. The possibility that he would not get up this time was not something the dog's mind was built to process. After that day, Ranger refused to work. He would not take commands from a new handler. He would not respond to his own name when a voice that was not the right voice said it. He would not eat from a hand that did not belong to the hand he had chosen. He sat in his kennel at the department's K9 facility, and he stared at the concrete wall, and he waited. He waited with the patience that belongs only to creatures who do not understand death the way human beings understand it, which is to say, he waited without acceptance, without resignation, without any of the psychological mechanisms that people develop over a lifetime to survive the experience of losing someone they cannot live without. He simply waited. Every morning, every evening, for months. The department made the decision to euthanize him. It was a budgetary decision dressed up in the language of compassion. The dog was non-functional. The dog was occupying kennel space. The dog was consuming resources that could be allocated to a working animal. The paperwork was filed on a Tuesday. The veterinary appointment was scheduled for a Friday. The form had a line at the bottom for the signature of the officer who would be present during the procedure, and the line was blank because no one in that department wanted to be the person who signed his name under the sentence that ended a dog who had spent 4 hours lying on a dead man's chest because leaving was not in his programming. Gunnar heard about it from a cousin's wife who worked dispatch at the same department. She mentioned it over the phone the way people mention things they wish somebody would do something about but have already accepted that nobody will. She said there is this dog, this police dog they are going to put down because he will not work with anyone new after his handler got killed in that stairwell shooting last year. She said it the way you mention a storm that is coming, or an article you read about something sad that happened to someone you do not know. She said it, and then she moved on to something else. Gunnar did not move on. Gunnar hung up the phone and stood in the middle of his shop for a long time staring at nothing, his hands hanging at his sides, his mind turning over a single thought, the way a man turns over a stone he has found in a field, examining it from every angle. Then he walked to his Harley. He put on his helmet. He threw a leg over the seat and kicked the engine to life and rode out of the gravel lot and onto the 2-lane highway heading east. He drove 11 hours straight, through the night, across 2 state lines, through high desert and agricultural flatland, and the outskirts of cities he had never visited, and had no reason to visit, and would never visit again. He arrived at the K9 facility at 7 in the morning, 3 hours before the veterinarian was scheduled to arrive, with a needle and a form, and the clinical efficiency of a man doing a job he does not enjoy but has agreed to perform. Gunnar paid the kennel fee in cash. He signed the adoption paperwork with a name that was not his legal name, because a man in his position does not put his real name on documents that end up in government filing systems. He walked to the back of the facility where the kennels were, and he stood in front of the chain-link door of a run where a dog was lying on a concrete floor with his chin on his paws and his eyes on the wall and his body so still that for a moment Gunnar thought he was already dead. The kennel officer opened the door. The dog did not move. The officer said, "He will not come to you. He has not come to anyone since the day we brought him back." Gunnar did not respond to the officer. He walked into the kennel, and he crouched down, and he looked at the dog for a long time, and the dog looked at the wall, and neither of them moved. Then Gunnar stood up. He turned around and walked out of the kennel, and down the corridor, and out the front door, and across the parking lot to his Harley. He opened the sidecar compartment. He took out a wool blanket that he kept there for cold rides. He walked back inside down the corridor into the kennel, and he draped the blanket over the dog. Then he picked the dog up. 70 pounds of dense, rigid muscle, a body locked in the stillness of an animal that has decided there is nothing left in the world worth moving toward. Gunnar carried him out of the kennel, down the corridor, past the officer who was standing with the paperwork in his hand, and his mouth slightly open, out the front door across the parking lot, and he placed the dog in the sidecar of his motorcycle with the blanket arranged over his head so that the dog would not have to see the city where his handler had died, growing smaller in the distance. He drove 11 hours back. He carried the dog into his shop and set him down in the corner behind the workbench and put a bowl of water on the floor beside him and walked away without looking back. For the first 3 months, Ranger lived under the workbench. He growled at anyone who walked past the shop door. He ate only when the building was empty and Gunnar had gone outside or into the back room. He drank from the water bowl that Gunnar replaced twice a day, morning and evening, without commentary, without expectation, without the performance of kindness that human beings sometimes engage in when they want credit for being patient. Gunnar left an old leather jacket on the concrete floor next to the space under the workbench where the dog had made his den. The jacket had been on Gunnar's body for the better part of a decade. It smelled like engine oil and road dust and the salt of sweat and the particular chemical signature of a man's skin, a signature as unique as a fingerprint and far more meaningful to an animal whose primary interface with the world is its nose. Gunnar did not place the jacket there with ceremony. He did not explain to the dog what it was or why it was there. He simply dropped it on the floor on his way to bed one night, the way a man drops something he does not need anymore, and left it there. He did not try to pet the dog. He did not crouch beside the workbench and extend his hand palm up in the gesture of submission that dog trainers teach as the universal language of "I am not a threat." He did not speak to the dog in the high, soft tone that people use when they want an animal to like them. He did not try to earn the dog's trust, because Gunnar understood something that most people do not understand about trust, which is that it cannot be earned by trying to earn it. It can only be earned by being present without agenda, by occupying the same space as another living creature, day after day, without asking for anything in return. The way a mountain occupies the same space as the weather, not trying to change it, not trying to resist it, just being there while it does what it does. 90 days passed. 90 mornings of Gunnar filling the water bowl and leaving food and walking to the workbench and picking up a wrench and going to work on an engine while a dog lay 3 feet away and watched the wall. 90 evenings of Gunnar wiping his hands on a rag and turning off the shop lights and walking to the back room where his cot was and lying down in the dark and listening to the silence of a building that contained 2 creatures who had both lost someone and were both learning in their own way, at their own pace, how to exist in a world where the someone they had lost was not coming back. On the 90th night, Gunnar was lying on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The door to the shop was open, the way it always was, because Gunnar did not close interior doors. The room was dark. The shop was dark. The only light came from the moon through the high window above the workbench, a pale stripe of silver that fell across the concrete floor like a road made of light. He heard the sound of nails on concrete, clicking, irregular. The cadence of a dog walking on a hard surface, each step a small declaration of presence. The sound came closer. It stopped at the doorway to the back room. Gunnar did not move. He did not look. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and waited with the same patience he had been practicing for 90 days. Ranger walked into the room. He jumped onto the foot of the cot. The springs sagged under the added weight. The dog turned 3 times in the tight space, the ancient circling ritual that dogs have performed for thousands of years to flatten imaginary grass in a den they have chosen, and he lay down. He placed his chin on Gunnar's ankle. He closed his eyes. He did not move until morning. That was it. That was the whole courtship. 90 days of silence and a leather jacket on a concrete floor, and then a dog at the foot of a man's bed with his chin on the man's ankle, and a decision made in the dark that did not require language or ceremony or any of the complicated architecture that human beings build around the act of choosing someone. After that night, where Gunnar went, Ranger went. To the shop every morning. To the road when the road called. to chapter meetings at the back of Mercer's cigar bar, where men with scarred knuckles and complicated histories sat in low light and discussed things in voices that did not carry past the walls. The other members of the Iron Wolves learned fast not to make sudden moves around Gunner's motorcycle because the dog in the sidecar did not bark. Barking is a communication. It is a dog's way of saying, "I see you, and I have an opinion about what you are doing, and I would like you to be aware of that opinion before you proceed." Ranger did not communicate. Ranger assessed. He looked at you with a stillness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with a readiness so complete that it did not need to announce itself. Once that dog looked at you in a certain way, you understood immediately and permanently that barking was a courtesy. You were not going to be extended the way a bullet does not send a letter of introduction before it arrives at its destination. Gunner kept Ranger's old K9 vest in the saddlebag of his Harley. He never put it on the dog. He never showed it to anyone. He never mentioned it. But it was there, folded neatly, the Velcro straps aligned, the faded lettering still legible. Ready, the way a retired soldier keeps a dress uniform in the back of a closet, not because he will ever wear it again, but because throwing it away would mean something he is not prepared to let it mean, not yet, maybe not ever. Now, the trouble. There was a man in the chapter named Dax Riggs, 38 years old, big through the shoulders and the chest, the kind of size that comes from moving heavy things for a living and enjoying the process of becoming the kind of man who can move heavy things. He had a face that was not unpleasant to look at, but that never quite settled into an expression you could trust, the way a mirror in a funhouse never quite shows you the shape you expected to see. He had a smile that arrived on his face a full beat before his eyes decided whether to participate the gap between the two, creating a momentary dissonance that most people felt without being able to name. The way you feel a drop in barometric pressure without knowing why the air suddenly seems heavier. Dax wore his chapter patch the way some men wear a badge, not as a symbol of belonging, but as a source of authority. A license to stand in certain rooms and say certain things and expect certain reactions. He shook hands with a grip that held on one beat too long, the way a man shakes hands when he is measuring you for something you did not agree to be measured for. Dax had started running side work that the chapter president Slade Donovan had not approved and the chapter table had not voted on. The work involved pharmaceuticals. Oxycodone primarily, but also other substances that came in small bags and left the state in the saddlebags of young men who had been told by Dax that carrying product was what real loyalty looked like, that brothers shouldered weight for each other, that the revenue would flow back to the chapter and support the causes and the families that the chapter existed to protect. The revenue did not flow back to the chapter. The revenue flowed into accounts that Dax controlled, and from there into investments and purchases that had nothing to do with brotherhood and everything to do with the ambition of a man who had looked at the chapter and seen not a family, but a franchise that he was entitled to a larger share of. The routes crossed 2 state lines. The supply connections were to men in other organizations who did not care about patches or oaths or any of the systems of loyalty that held the Iron Wolves together like rivets in a steel beam. They cared about product moving and money arriving and the quiet efficiency of a distribution network that hid behind the cultural camouflage of motorcycle brotherhood. 3 young prospects had been drawn into it. Boys who were 20 and 21 years old, with fresh patches and a hunger to prove they belonged that was so acute it overrode the voice in the back of their minds that told them something was wrong with what they were being asked to do. Gunner had been watching. He had been watching for 6 months with the patience and precision of a man who has been a sergeant at arms for 2 decades and who understands that the difference between suspicion and evidence is the difference between a conversation and a verdict. He kept a notebook. The notebook lived in the top drawer of his workbench locked with a small brass key on a chain around his neck. In the notebook were license plate numbers that did not match any vehicle registered to a chapter member, dates that corresponded to runs that had never been put before the table for a vote, names of men in other states whose phone numbers appeared on call logs that should not have existed, dollar amounts that did not reconcile with any chapter ledger, fuel receipts from gas stations on highways that were not on any route the chapter had authorized. He brought the notebook to Slade Donovan on a Tuesday night. The cigar bar was empty. The chairs were stacked on the tables. The overhead lights were off, and the only illumination came from a small lamp on the bar and the glow of the exit sign above the back door. Gunnar laid the notebook on the table between two glasses of whiskey that neither man had any intention of drinking. He said, "This is not a conversation I want to have, but it is a conversation we need to have." Slade picked up the notebook. He opened it to the first page. He read every entry, every date, every plate number, every name, every dollar amount. He turned the pages with the deliberate slowness of a man reading something that is going to change the trajectory of events in a way that cannot be reversed. He did not speak while he read. The silence between the two men was not empty. It was full of the weight of what was going to happen next, and the shared understanding that once it happened, there was no path back to the way things had been before. When Slade finished, he closed the notebook. He placed both hands flat on the table. He looked at Gunnar for a long time. Then he said two sentences. He said, "Call the table for Thursday," and he said, "Bring the notebook." Thursday came. The table was called. 9 men sat in the back room of Mercer's cigar bar, and the heavy door was closed, and the music in the front room was turned up loud enough to cover whatever sounds came through the walls. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. When it was over, Dax Riggs and 4 of his people were told their colors were pulled, their vests were to be surrendered, their access to chapter property, chapter accounts, and chapter contacts was terminated effective immediately. They were given 24 hours to turn in their leather and clear their personal belongings from any location associated with the club. Dax stood up from the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not overturn his chair or throw a punch or reach for the knife that everyone at the table knew he kept clipped inside the back of his belt. He stood up slowly with the controlled deliberation of a man who has been expecting this moment and has already planned what comes after it. He looked around the table at each man in turn, his eyes stopping on each face for exactly long enough to communicate that the face had been recorded, and then he came to Gunnar. His eyes stopped on Gunnar, and they stayed there. What was in them was not anger. Anger is a fire that burns itself out. What was in Dax Riggs's eyes was ice. It was the cold clarity of a calculation that has been completed, a balance sheet that has been finalized, a debt that has been entered into a ledger that does not have an expiration date. He said one sentence. He said, "You just wrote yourself a real interesting ending, old man." Then he turned and walked out of the back room. His 4 people followed him through the door and through the bar and out into the parking lot, and the sound of their engines starting and their tires on the gravel was the last sound anyone in that room heard for a long time because no one spoke after the door closed. There was nothing to say. The thing had been done. What came next would come on its own schedule. They did not disappear. Dax and his crew went south 60 miles into a stretch of high desert and pine forest where the nearest sheriff's substation was an hour's drive away, and the land was the kind of empty that swallows men and machinery and evidence without leaving a trace. They set up in an abandoned hunting compound, 3 cinder block buildings behind a chain-link fence, and they started calling themselves the Splinter Crew. They made a new patch. They made new plans. And they waited the way that men who have been humiliated wait, with a patience that is not patience at all, but the slow accumulation of rage compressed into something harder and more dangerous than rage itself. Gunnar knew this. The chapter knew this. The knowing came not from intelligence reports or surveillance. but from the physical evidence of escalation that arrived at Gunner's shop and at the cigar bar in a steady, measured rhythm, each incident slightly worse than the last, each one a message written in the language of inevitability. First, a brick through the front window of the shop at 2 in the morning. The glass exploded inward across the workbench and onto the floor, and Ranger was on his feet before the last shard stopped sliding across the concrete, standing in the dark with his ears forward and his body squared toward the broken window, not barking, just standing, his outline lit by the streetlight outside like a shadow that had decided to become solid. A chapter brother named Hayes, who worked construction, replaced the glass the next morning without charging for the labor. When he was done, he looked at Gunner and said, "I can put in bulletproof if you want." Gunner said regular glass is fine. Then tire tracks through the gravel lot. Fresh ones made in the middle of the night in a pattern that circled the building once and then departed through the same gap in the fence they had come through. The message was simple and did not need to be written down. We were here. We know where this building is. We can reach it anytime we choose. Then, a dead coyote on the doorstep of Mercer's cigar bar. The animal had been shot through the head and laid on the welcome mat, with its legs arranged in a posture that was almost natural, almost as if it had simply decided to lie down and die in this particular spot. Stapled to its ear was a note written in ballpoint pen on a piece of lined yellow paper. The handwriting belonged to Dax Riggs. The note said, "Next one is bigger." And then, at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, the phone in Gunner's back room rang. He picked up the receiver and said nothing, and waited. The voice on the other end said one sentence and hung up. The sentence was, "We know where the dog sleeps." Gunner placed the phone back on the nightstand. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sound of Ranger breathing at the foot of his cot. The dog was asleep. His breaths were long and rhythmic, and trusting the breaths of a creature who has decided that the man in the room is responsible for keeping the world outside the room and who has no reason to doubt that arrangement. Gunner had not been afraid for himself in a very long time. 22 years on the road had burned the fear of personal death out of him, the way repeated exposure to fire eventually burns the fear of fire out of a man who works with welding torches for a living. You do not stop respecting what can kill you. You simply stop letting the respect turn into something that interferes with the work. He had watched friends die. He had attended funerals where the casket was closed because what was inside no longer resembled the man who had occupied it. He had made his peace with the fact that one day the road or the life or his own aging body was going to present a bill, and he would pay it the way he paid all his bills, standing up on time without negotiation. But the dog was a different matter entirely. The dog was the one living thing in his world that had chosen him without conditions, without prerequisites, without any knowledge of who Gunner Steele was, or what he had done, or what the patches on his vest signified. The dog had chosen him on the 90th night for reasons that belonged entirely to the dog, and Gunner understood in a way he would never attempt to articulate that this was the purest contract he had ever been party to, an agreement made without signatures, witnessed by no one, binding in a way that no human arrangement had ever bound him. He moved Ranger's bed into the back room of the shop where the walls were cinder block 8 inches thick, and the only door was a steel fire door with a deadbolt and a reinforced frame. He started keeping a sawed-off shotgun behind the workbench, 12-gauge loaded safety off, positioned within arm's reach of the spot where he stood when he was working on engines. He went to Slade Donovan on a Thursday evening, and he said plainly, without drama or theatrical gravity, the way a man discusses the disposition of his assets before a surgery, "He is not certain he will wake up from," he said. "If anything happens to me, the chapter takes care of the dog. Do not put him in a shelter. Do not give him to a stranger. One of you takes him, and one of you keeps him until he dies of old age in a place where he is not alone." Slade had nodded once. He had said, "We will take care of both of you while you are still here, Gunner. And after, if it comes to that." 3 days later, the phone in the shop rang in the middle of the afternoon. Gunner was working on the timing chain of a 1972 Harley shovelhead that had been waiting 6 months for his attention. Ranger was in his usual spot, near the bay door, chin on paws, one ear rotated toward the road. Gunner wiped his hands on a rag and picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was immediately and completely familiar. It belonged to Wade Holden. Wade was Gunner's age. They had ridden together for 15 years. Wade had been the chapter's vice president for 8 of those years before he retired clean. No drama, no bitterness. Just a man who had looked at his life and decided that the next chapter of it would be quieter than the first. He had moved up into the mountains north of town to a cabin on 12 acres, surrounded by ponderosa pines and not much else. He kept bees. He stayed sober. He lived with his wife Faye in the kind of deliberate quiet that men who have spent decades being loud sometimes need the way they need air. Gunner had been to the cabin twice. Once in the fall when the aspen groves on the mountain had turned gold and the air smelled like wood smoke and cold water and the particular kind of peace that comes from being high enough above the world to see it clearly. Once in the spring when Wade had rebuilt the cabin's front porch and wanted someone to sit on it with him and drink coffee and say nothing, which was one of Gunner's primary talents. Faye had cooked for him both times. The venison stew from the fall visit was a dish Gunner still mentioned on cold nights at the cigar bar, not because the stew itself was extraordinary, although it was, but because the act of being fed by a woman who expected nothing in return was an experience Gunner had not had since his wife died 11 years ago, and missing it was a wound that had never fully closed. Wade said on the phone that Faye was sick. Cancer. The fast kind that does not send advance notice or offer negotiation. He said he needed Gunner to come up to the cabin just for an hour because there was something he wanted to give him, something personal, something he could not discuss on a telephone. He said time was not something Faye had much of anymore, and he would rather do this now than wish he had done it later. Gunner listened. He stood in his shop with the phone against his ear and one hand resting on the edge of the workbench, and he listened with his whole body the way a man listens when the surface of a conversation seems ordinary, but the current underneath it is pulling in a direction he does not want to go. Something was wrong. The cadence of the voice was off. Wade Holden was a man who talked with his hands even when you could not see them, a man whose voice carried the physical energy of gesture and movement, a man who could not hold a pause for longer than 2 seconds without filling it with a joke or a digression or a story about the bees that had gotten into the kitchen through a crack in the window frame. The man on the phone paused too long, spoke too evenly, pronounced his words with the measured care of a man who is reading from something rather than speaking from a life. But Gunner also understood this. If he was wrong, if Faye was genuinely dying and Wade genuinely needed him, and Gunner had not gone because the rhythm of a phone call felt half a beat off, he would carry that failure for the rest of whatever time he had left. He would carry it the way he carried every other failure he had accumulated over 64 years silently in the center of his chest, in the place where the weight lived. And that place was already carrying enough. So he went. He went on the bike. He took Ranger in the sidecar. He took the dog's blanket and the saddlebag, with the K9 vest folded inside it. He did not take the shotgun. He left it leaning against the wall in the back room next to the dog's empty bed, and he did not realize he had left it until he was already 10 miles up the mountain road, and the realization landed on the back of his neck like a cold hand and settled into his stomach like a stone. The mountain road was narrow and switchbacked and shaded by ponderosa pines that turned the pavement into a ribbon of alternating light and shadow. The air changed as he climbed. It thinned and cooled and took on the scent of pine resin and snowmelt, and the particular kind of quiet that exists only at altitude where the atmosphere has thinned enough that sound does not travel as far, and the silence between sounds becomes the dominant feature of the landscape. Halfway up, the bike started running rough. A subtle stutter in the throttle response, a slight hesitation in the engine's rhythm, the kind of disturbance that a man who has not spent 40 years listening to Harley engines would dismiss as a bump in the road, but that Gunnar recognized instantly as a problem with fuel delivery. The engine was starving, not enough to stall on flat ground, just enough to struggle on the incline of a mountain switchback where gravity changed the angle of the fuel in the line, and a marginal restriction became a critical one. He pulled over at a wide spot near a creek where the road shoulder was gravel and the drop-off beyond it fell 50 feet through pine and shadow to the sound of water moving over stones. He killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the forest was enormous around him. He could hear the creek below. He could hear a jay calling from somewhere deep in the trees. He could hear Ranger already standing in the sidecar, already facing the tree line with his ears up, and the hair along his spine raised into a ridge of dark fur that made him look 5 pounds heavier and a great deal more dangerous than he looked when the hair was flat. Gunnar got off the bike and crouched down and looked at the engine. He found the problem in 3 seconds. The fuel line at the carburetor had been loosened, not cut, not disconnected, loosened, backed off just enough to bleed fuel under the pressure demands of a climb, just enough to starve the engine on a grade where the physics of gravity and flow conspired to turn a minor restriction into a shutdown. This was not road vibration, this was not wear, this was sabotage done by someone who understood engines well enough to calibrate the failure to choose a specific location and a specific kind of mechanical death that would leave a man stranded on a specific kind of road at a specific kind of altitude where cell signals do not reach and other vehicles do not pass, and the only witnesses are the trees. Gunnar reached for the saddlebag. His hand went to the place where the shotgun was supposed to be the gap between the folded K9 vest and the rain cover where the short barrels nestled against the leather. His hand found the vest. His hand found the rain cover. His hand found the empty space where the weapon should have been, and was not because it was leaning against a wall 60 miles away in a back room where it was doing no one any good at all. He had time for one thought. The thought arrived without panic, because panic was a reaction Gunnar Steele had misplaced sometime in his 40s and had never gone looking for. The thought was clean and complete and final, the way a mathematical proof is final, the way the last line of a will is final. The thought was, this is the day. They came out of the trees on both sides of the road. 4 men. Dax Riggs in the center, emerging from the brush with the unhurried stride of a man who has been crouching in the cold for hours and is in no rush now that the waiting is over, because the waiting was always the hardest part, and everything that follows is just the machinery running the way he built it to run. 2 of the 4 carried pistols, cheap semi-automatic handguns, held low against their thighs, in the grip of men who are accustomed to holding weapons, but not particularly trained in their tactical deployment. 1 carried a length of galvanized steel pipe, a 3-foot section held in both hands, like a baseball bat. Dax carried nothing in his hands. Dax carried his smile, the one that arrived on his face ahead of his eyes, the one that created a gap between the expression and the intent behind it that was wide enough to fall into. Gunnar stepped away from the bike. He positioned himself between the sidecar where Ranger was standing and the 4 men who were walking toward him. He stood with his hands at his sides and his feet shoulder-width apart and his chin level and his eyes moving between the 4 faces with the calm efficiency of a man cataloging threats in order of priority, which was a thing Gunnar Steele had been doing for 22 years and could do in his sleep. He said in a voice that carried no tremor and no bravado and no plea, a voice as flat and factual as a weather report, he said, "Take a minute, boys. Think about what comes after this." Dax walked up close enough for Gunnar to smell the whiskey and the sweat, and beneath both of those, the sharp chemical sourness of methamphetamine leaving a body through skin that has not been washed in several days. Dax looked at Gunnar the way a man looks at a project he has been working on for weeks that is finally ready for completion with satisfaction but not pleasure, with the business-like focus of a man closing a deal. He said, "Gunnar, we have been thinking about it for 3 weeks. We are done thinking." The pipe came down across the back of Gunnar's knees. The world inverted. The sky changed places with the gravel. His palms hit the ground first, then his kneecaps, then the side of his face, and the pain arrived in a single detonation that started in his legs and traveled up through every link of his spine and exploded behind his eyes in a white flash that was not light, but the nervous system's emergency broadcast the signal that tells the brain something structural has just been compromised. Ranger was in the air before Gunnar's knees touched the gravel. The dog did not wait for a command because there was no command for this. There was no hand signal, no whistle, no word in any language that covers the specific tactical scenario of 4 armed men attacking your person on an isolated mountain road. There was only the calculation, ancient and instantaneous, that fires in the space between one heartbeat and the next in the brain of an animal that has been bred and trained and refined by 10,000 years of partnership with humans to perform one function without hesitation and without error: protect. Ranger hit the closest gunman at the wrist, not the arm, not the chest, the wrist, because the wrist is where the weapon is, and a K9 trained in bite work does not concern itself with the man. It concerns itself with the weapon. The dog's jaws closed with 700 pounds of pressure concentrated in the narrow space between the radius and the ulna, and the result was immediate and absolute. The pistol went one direction, a portion of the wrist went another. The man screamed in a frequency Gunnar had never heard a grown man produce a sound that originated not in the lungs or the throat, but in the most ancient part of the human brain, the part that remembers what it means to be prey. Dax shouted, "Hit the dog! Hit the dog!" The second pistol swung toward Ranger. Gunnar threw his body over the dog, covering the animal with his chest and back and arms the way a parent covers a child, during an explosion absorbing with his own body the blow that was aimed at the creature beneath him. A boot connected with his ribs. A fist grabbed his hair and slammed his face into the gravel. His arms were wrenched behind his back, and the zip ties went on the hard plastic, ratcheting tight around his wrists, with a series of clicks that sounded like a lock, engaging each click a small, irreversible statement of fact. He could hear Ranger still fighting. The snarling was a continuous vibration, not a sound you heard with your ears, so much as a frequency you felt in your chest, the deep resonance of a 70-pound animal channeling every fiber of its being into the single purpose of reaching the men who had hurt its person. But the sound was moving away. Someone had gotten a rope around the dog's neck. Someone was dragging him backward through the gravel. The snarling mixed with the scrabble of claws on stone, the desperate sound of an animal losing traction against a force it could not overcome. Then a yelp. One sharp note of pain that cut through everything else the way a single high note cuts through a symphony. Then silence. Gunnar tried to lift his head. A hand pushed it back into the gravel. A voice near his ear said in a tone that was almost conversational, almost friendly, the tone of a man discussing the weather with a neighbor. The voice said, "Do not worry about the dog. The dog is done." They pulled a hood over his head. They lifted him into the bed of a truck. The tailgate slammed shut. The engine started. The truck began to move, and Gunnar lay in the dark under the hood, feeling the road change beneath him, the way a blind man feels the texture of the ground through the soles of his shoes. Pavement, then gravel, then dirt, then the random jarring violence of terrain that had never been touched by any machine designed to make travel smooth. They drove for a long time. They drove into the kind of distance that erases a man from the knowable world. When the hood came off, Gunnar was in a stand of ponderosa pines, so dense that the sky was visible only as a narrow gray ribbon woven through the tops of the trees. The air was cold and thin, and smelled like wet bark and decaying needles and the metallic undertone of mineral-rich soil. No sound from the world below reached this place. No road noise, no aircraft, no human voice except the voices of the men who had brought him here and who were now standing around a tree that was wider than 2 men and preparing the thing they had come here to do. The tree had a logging chain bolted into its trunk at chest height, heavy-gauge steel, the kind of chain used to drag felled timber through rough terrain, each link thick enough that a man could spend the rest of his natural life pulling against it and accomplish nothing measurable. There were 4 padlocks. There was duct tape. There was the quiet efficiency of men performing a task they have rehearsed. They put Gunnar's back against the tree. They wrapped the chain around his chest and his upper arms and his wrists. They threaded it 4 times and locked it in 4 places with 4 separate padlocks. Each lock a redundancy. Each redundancy a statement about how certain they wanted to be that this man was not leaving this tree under his own power. They stretched duct tape across his mouth and pressed it down at the corners with careful thumbs. Dax Riggs crouched in front of him. He was close enough that Gunnar could see the broken capillaries in the whites of his eyes and the dry, cracked skin at the corners of his mouth and the particular quality of focus that belongs to a man who has not slept properly in weeks and has been sustaining himself on chemicals and anticipation. He said, "Gunnar, I want you to listen carefully because I am only going to say this once. Nobody is coming for you. You told Slade you were going to visit Wade Holden up at his cabin. Wade Holden is in the trunk of his own car at the bottom of the lake behind his property. His wife Faye is with him. The phone call you received this afternoon was made from a phone that is now in pieces in a drainage ditch 20 miles from here. Your motorcycle is going to be found on the road with the keys in the ignition and no visible signs of struggle. By the time anyone connects your absence to this location, there will be nothing left of you worth finding. The forest will have done what the forest does." He stood up. He dusted his knees with his palms. He looked down at Gunnar with the expression of a man surveying a completed project. Then he said one more thing. "We left the dog about a mile up the trail, shot him and left him in the brush. I mention it so you have something to think about while you wait. I want you to know that he is up there and that he is not going to make it and that there is nothing you can do about it. I want that to be the last thought you carry." They walked away. Gunnar heard the truck doors open and close. He heard the engine turn over. He heard the tires find the dirt track and roll along it, the sound growing fainter by degrees until it was absorbed by the forest and replaced by the enormous silence of a place where no human being was meant to stay for long. He was alone. The pines. His own breathing against the duct tape. The slow, steady drip of blood from his wrists where the chain links had bitten through skin, each drop falling into the dirt between his boots with a sound like a metronome set to the tempo of a body's slow decline. Drip, drip, drip. A clock nobody had asked to be wound counting down toward a number that Gunnar could not see but could feel, approaching the way you feel the edge of a cliff before you can see it, a change in the air, a thinning of the ground beneath your feet. The body's ancient knowledge that the solid world is about to end. He tried to work the chains. He pulled until the muscles in his shoulders felt like they were separating from the bones they were attached to. He twisted until the skin on his wrists split open wider and the blood flowed faster. He pressed his back against the tree trunk and pushed with everything his legs could generate. And the tree did not care, and the chain did not care, and the padlocks did not care. He was a 64-year-old man with broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder, pushing against a ponderosa pine that had been growing in this spot for 200 years. The math was settled before he started. He stopped trying. The sun moved. An hour passed, maybe 2. He could not track the time with any precision because the canopy was too thick to see the sun's position, and his internal clock had been scrambled by pain and blood loss, and the cold that was beginning to settle into his body. The way water settles into the low places of a landscape, finding every gap, filling every space, turning the living warmth of a human body into something that felt increasingly like terrain. A Steller's jay called once from deep in the forest. The sound was sharp and bright and absurd, a piece of ordinary life inserted into a moment that was the opposite of ordinary. Then the bird did not call again. A breeze came through the tops of the pines and dropped a single brown needle onto Gunner's shoulder, and he could not brush it off, and it sat there weightless, meaningless, a tiny piece of the world that did not know or care that a man was dying beneath it. He thought about his wife. She had been gone 11 years. Lung cancer. The kind that moves through a body the way a fire moves through a dry forest, consuming everything in its path with a speed that makes planning irrelevant and hope a form of denial. He had held her hand at the end. He had sat in a plastic chair beside her hospital bed and held her hand and watched the monitors and listened to the sound of the machines that were keeping her body running, while the part of her that was her, the part that laughed at his jokes and burned the toast and forgave him every single time he came home late, smelling like whiskey and road dust, that part had already gone somewhere the machines could not follow. She had asked him not to cry. She had said with a clarity that astonished him, given what the morphine was doing to the rest of her thoughts. She had said, "Gunner, I need you to not do that. I need you to be the thing you are. Be still. Be steady. Let me go the way you let me live, which is without a fuss." He had honored that request. He had sat in that chair and held her hand and watched her die, and he had not cried because she had asked him not to, and Gunner Steele honored requests. He thought about Nora, his daughter. She would be 35 now. He did not know where she lived. He did not know what she did for work. He did not know if she was happy or healthy or married or alone. He knew nothing about the 11 years of her life that had passed since she had stood in the doorway of his shop and said the words that had hit him harder than any fist or pipe or bullet ever had. She had said this, "Life killed her dad, and you just stood there and let it happen." He had not argued. He had not defended himself. He had not explained that the life and the death were not the same thing, and that loving a woman who was married to a man in a motorcycle club was not the same as being killed by it, and that the cancer had come from somewhere that had nothing to do with leather vests and Wednesday night meetings. He had not said any of those things because in the moment she said it standing in that doorway with her mother's eyes and her mother's jaw and a rage in her voice that came from the same place as grief. In that moment, Gunner had looked at his daughter and seen something he recognized. He saw a person who needed someone to blame because the alternative to blame was accepting that terrible things happen to good people for no reason, and that there is nothing anyone can do to prevent it, and that love, even perfect love, which his was not, does not protect the people you love from the thing that takes them. So he had let her blame him. He had stood in the doorway and watched her drive away, and he had not moved because moving would have been a form of argument, and he was not going to argue with his daughter's grief. He would let it be. He would let it run its course. He would wait. He was still waiting. 11 years later, chained to a tree on a mountain bleeding into the dirt, he was still waiting. He said her name every day, not out loud, in the quiet space behind his sternum where the important words lived. Nora. Every morning when he opened his eyes. Nora. Every night before he closed them. A prayer he did not believe would be answered, but could not stop praying because stopping would mean admitting the prayer was over, and the prayer was the only conversation he had left with his daughter. He thought about Ranger. lying somewhere up the trail a mile north in the dark trees, bleeding from wounds that men had inflicted on him because he had tried to protect the only person left in the world who mattered to him. Alone. In the way that dogs are alone when they have been hurt, past the point of function, and the body takes over and tells the mind it is time to find a quiet place and lie down and close your eyes and let the thing that is happening finish happening without an audience. Dogs do not die for show. They die in private. They go somewhere the people who love them cannot follow, and they do it alone because that is the arrangement between the living and the dying, and dogs honor the arrangement even though no one ever explained it to them. Gunner's chin dropped to his chest. His eyes closed. The pain had receded to a dull, generalized throb that was everywhere, and therefore nowhere the way a sound becomes inaudible when it reaches a certain volume and duration, the body's merciful decision to stop reporting what it can no longer fix. He drifted, not unconscious, not asleep. Somewhere between the two, a gray place where thought thinned out and time stopped mattering, and the world contracted to the diameter of his own breathing in and out through his nose above the tape, each breath a small affirmation that the machinery was still running, even though the operator had let go of the controls. A branch cracked. His eyes opened halfway. He listened. The forest was full of sounds that meant nothing. Branches fall. Animals move. The wind pushes things around. He let his eyes close again. Another crack. Closer. Heavier. The kind of sound that carries the signature of weight and direction, a thing moving through the underbrush with purpose, not drifting, not wandering, moving toward a destination. This was the moment. This was what he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. They had come back. Dax had come back. Patient men always come back to verify their work because patient men understand that an unverified outcome is the same as an incomplete one. An incomplete work is the kind of loose end that unravels everything you have built. Gunner could not lift his head, but he was listening now with everything he had left, which was not much, but was everything. He was listening the way a man listens for the sound that will be the last sound he ever processes, with a terrible attention that strips away every thought and every memory and every feeling that is not directly relevant to the act of identifying what is coming through those trees. Then the growl, low, from behind him, from the side of the forest the men had not come from. Gunner knew that growl. He had heard it 3 times in 7 years. Once in the alley behind the shop when a stranger had reached without warning toward Gunner's coat pocket. Once in the parking lot of a roadside diner when a drunk teenager had grabbed the handlebar of his Harley. Once at the back of the cigar bar when a visiting patch holder from another club had said something at the table that should not have been said to the man it was said to. This was not a warning growl. A warning growl is a question posed to the world. Are you sure you want to do this? This was not a question. This was a verdict. This was the sound the dog made after he had already analyzed every angle and calculated every distance and decided exactly what was going to happen and was giving the universe one final moment to understand the decision before it was executed. Gunner lifted his head. Ranger came around the side of the tree. The left side of his body was a landscape of damage. The fur and skin over his ribs had been torn away in a ragged stripe that ran from shoulder to hip, exposing the white lattice of bone beneath the ribs, visible and moving with each breath like the keys of an instrument being played by an invisible hand. There was a wound on his neck, a round entry point surrounded by a dark starburst of dried blood the size of a dinner plate, the signature of a bullet that had entered and exited, and by some arrangement between physics and fate, had managed to miss every structure that needed not to be hit. One eye was sealed shut behind a mound of purple-black swelling that had closed the lid completely. His collar was gone. They had ripped it from his neck. He was walking with a limp that was not quite a limp and not quite a stagger, but something in between each step, a negotiation between what his body was capable of and what his will demanded of it, and his will was winning, but it was winning by the thinnest possible margin, the way a runner wins a race by a stride, the way a poker player wins a hand by a single card, the margin so small that if you blinked, you would miss the fact that it was there at all. But he was alive, and he had come. The dog put his nose against Gunner's bound hands. He held it there. His breath was fast and shallow and warm against the torn skin of Gunner's wrists. The warmth was the warmth of a living animal who had been shot and beaten and left to die in the woods and had gotten up anyway, and walked through pain that most human beings would not have been able to walk through because the man on the other end of the walk was the reason for walking, and there was no pain in the world significant enough to override that reason. Gunner made a sound behind the duct tape. It was not a word. It was not a name. It was the closest thing to a prayer that a man like Gunner Steele had produced in 40 years, a sound that came from below the floor of language, from the basement of the human experience, where the most important communications live, the ones that do not need words, because words would only diminish them. Then Ranger turned his head, hard, toward the trail. His one good eye locked onto the tree line, and the remains of the decision growl rose in his chest again, deeper this time, a vibration so low it was almost subsonic, felt more than heard. Someone was coming. The dog moved out from behind the tree and placed his broken body between Gunner and the trail, low, square, quiet. Every muscle that still functioned was engaged. Every remaining capacity was oriented toward the tree line and whatever was about to come out of it. Footsteps. 2 sets. The sound of men walking through brush without concern for stealth, because they believed there was nothing alive in this clearing that they needed to be stealthy about. A voice low and casual. "I told you I heard something up here. Probably just a coyote nosing around." A second voice. "Then let us check and get out of here. I want to be off this mountain before dark." They came around the bend in the trail. What they saw was exactly what they expected to see. A man chained to a tree with his head down and his eyes closed and his body limp against the restraints, exactly the way a man looks when the life has drained out of him slowly enough for gravity to settle him into the posture of the dead. What they did not see until it was already in motion was 70 pounds of Belgian Malinois launching off the dirt to their right at a speed that the human visual system is not equipped to process in real time. Ranger hit the second man at the throat. There is a way a canine with bite work training takes a human being off his feet. It is not what civilians imagine. It is not a dramatic lunge and a growl and a prolonged wrestling match. It is a single moment of contact at full body velocity, followed by the head whip of violent rotation of the skull and neck that uses the dog's momentum and the human body's unfortunate tendency to follow wherever its throat goes to drop a grown man backward onto the ground with the speed and finality of a tree falling. The man went down. The pistol in his hand discharged once into the canopy overhead, and then it was in the dirt, and then nothing about that man was a factor in what happened next. Dax spun toward the noise. His hand was already bringing his own pistol up from his hip. Ranger released the first man and redirected. Not the throat this time, the gun hand, the wrist. The dog had been trained by men who understood the mathematics of multiple threats. Men who had taught him that, when there are 2 dangers and one of them has a weapon, you neutralize the weapon first because a disarmed man is a problem you can solve later, and an armed man is a problem that solves you now. He locked his jaw around Dax Riggs's gun wrist, and he held. The pistol fell. Dax dropped to one knee. He swung his free fist into the side of the dog's head with the full rotational force of a man who is fighting for his life. The impact shuddered through Ranger's body the way a shockwave travels through water. The jaw did not open. Dax hit him again. Harder. The dog's hind legs slid in the loose dirt. The jaw did not open. It was not going to open. Opening was not part of the calculation. Dax reached behind his back with his free hand. There was a knife clipped inside his belt. Gunnar, chained to the tree, saw the hand go around. He saw the fingers close on the handle. He saw the blade clear the leather and begin its arc toward the dog's neck. He tried to scream through the tape, and the sound that emerged was nothing less than nothing. The sound of a man watching the thing he loves most in the world about to be destroyed by a piece of sharpened steel and being unable to produce even one syllable of protest. Ranger let go of the wrist. He dropped below the arc of the blade. He was inside the swing before the knife completed its path, moving into the gap between the weapon and the body, with the speed and precision of an animal performing the maneuver it was trained to perform when all other options have been exhausted, and the handler is down, and the threat still has a weapon, and there is no backup coming, and there is no second attempt. He went for the throat. He did what he was trained to do. He did it once. The clearing went quiet. Ranger stood over the body for a long moment, shaking his shoulders dark with blood that was partly his own and partly not. His breath came in short, ragged bursts that sounded like something tearing at the seams. He took 2 unsteady steps away from what was on the ground, and he put his head against Gunnar's leg, pressing his skull against the shin with a pressure that was not affection and not exhaustion, but something that contained both and transcended both, the pressure of a living creature confirming through physical contact that the other living creature it exists for is still here, still warm, still breathing. Gunnar was crying. The kind of crying that happens behind duct tape and clenched teeth and a face that has not displayed emotion in public in 3 decades. The kind of crying that men of a certain generation and a certain life permit themselves exactly twice, and when they do it where no one can see, except that the dog could see. And the dog stayed against his leg and breathed against his shin and did not look away. And Gunnar understood. In a single moment of clarity that arrived whole and complete like a light turning on in a room that has been dark for years, he understood that this dog had walked a mile through dark forest with a bullet wound and broken ribs and one eye sealed shut to come back to him. Not because a command was given, not because training kicked in, because something in the ancient wiring of that animal's heart had performed a calculation simpler and more powerful than any calculation a human being has ever performed. His person was on a tree, so he went. Then Ranger lifted his head from Gunnar's leg. He turned away. He looked down the trail, and he walked. He walked away from Gunnar, past the bodies in the dirt, past the dropped weapons, past the knife, into the trees, into the darkness between the pines where the light did not reach, and the trail became a suggestion rather than a path. Gunnar watched him go. He could not call out through the tape. He could not follow. He could only watch the lean, bloody, staggering shape of his dog move away from him and disappear into the black spaces between the trunks of trees that had been standing in this forest long before either of them had been born. He thought the dog is going to die. He is going somewhere quiet, the way they always do. He is going somewhere I cannot follow because he does not want me to watch it happen. That is the deal between dogs and death. They honor it, even when it breaks the heart of the person they are leaving behind. He was wrong. Ranger was not going somewhere to die. Ranger had a job, and the job was 11 miles long. Belgian Malinois bred for police work do not learn their environment the way other dogs learn it. They learn maps. They learn buildings. They learn the route from the patrol car to the front door and back to the patrol car. They learn every room in a structure they have cleared once. They learn the distance between the kennel and the training ground, and the training ground and the handler's vehicle, and the handler's vehicle, and the place where the real work begins. These maps are not stored as memories in the way human beings understand memory. They are stored as architecture. They are load-bearing. They are permanent. Ranger had spent 7 years learning the geography of Gunnar's life. The shop, the back room, the cigar bar, the road between the shop and the cigar bar, the lot behind Slade Donovan's house, the diner on the highway where Gunner ate breakfast on Sunday mornings. Every route, every turn, every scent marker and landmark and subtle gradient of terrain that told a dog's nose where it was in relation to every other place it had ever been. He did not need the road. He did not need the switchbacks. He did not need anything that humans had built to help them find their way through a landscape they cannot navigate by smell alone. He needed the air to be moving in the right direction and his nose to be functioning, and both of those things were still operational, despite everything else that had been broken and shot and torn. He went down the mountain in a straight line, not following the logging road, not following the switchbacks that humans had carved into the terrain, cutting through brush and deadfall and creek bottoms with the single-minded directness of a projectile, which does not consider obstacles, which only considers the distance between where it is and where it needs to be. The first mile was the steepest. The grade dropped through a section of old-growth forest where the trees stood so close together that the spaces between them were barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Sideways, let alone a dog moving at speed with one side of his body torn open, and every breath a negotiation between what his lungs needed and what his cracked ribs would permit. Ranger did not slow down. He threaded the gaps between the trunks with the spatial awareness of an animal whose brain contains a three-dimensional model of every environment it has ever moved through, adjusting his trajectory by fractions of a degree without breaking stride the way a river adjusts around stones without losing momentum. The ground was covered in a layer of pine needles 6 inches deep, soft and treacherous, the kind of surface that absorbs sound and conceals the roots and rocks beneath it. His paws punched through the top layer with each stride and found purchase on the harder soil beneath, and the rhythm of his movement was not the rhythm of a healthy animal running, but the rhythm of a damaged machine operating past its tolerances, each cycle slightly different from the last, each footfall a small recalculation of what was possible given what had been lost. He bled as he ran. The wound on his ribs left a trail in the pine needles that anyone tracking him could have followed with their eyes closed, a dark line drawn across the forest floor like a sentence written in a language that only the trees would read. The blood was not flowing freely. It was seeping the slow, persistent bleed of a wound that has partially clotted, but that reopens with every expansion of the rib cage, every deep breath, every stride that stretches the torn tissue past the fragile architecture of the scab. He was losing volume. Not fast enough to drop him in the first mile. Maybe not even in the 5th. But the math was running in the background of his physiology, the way a countdown runs on a timer, and the number it was approaching was 0, and at 0 the muscles stop receiving what they need, and the legs stop doing what the brain tells them to do, and the body makes the decision that the will has been refusing to make, which is to stop. The first creek was narrow and shallow, barely knee-deep on a man, and the current was gentle enough that crossing it should have been unremarkable for a dog of Ranger's size and conditioning. But Ranger was not operating at his conditioning. He was operating at whatever fraction of his conditioning remained after a bullet and a beating and a mile of downhill running through dense forest on damaged legs. He entered the water and his front paws found the rocky bottom, and the cold hit him like a second blow, a full-body shock that made every wound he was carrying announce itself simultaneously, the ribs and the neck and the shoulder and the eye all firing at once in a chorus of damage that would have dropped most living things where they stood. His rear legs went out. The current, gentle as it was, caught his hindquarters and turned him sideways, and for a moment he was in the water. On his side, the torn ribs submerged the cold, rushing over the exposed bone and into the tissue beneath, and the sound he made was not a yelp and not a whine, but something between the two, a single involuntary note of protest from a body that had been pushed past every reasonable boundary and was now being asked to go further. He got his front legs under him. He drove forward with his shoulders and his chest dragging his hindquarters through the water by sheer force of upper body, his claws scraping across the stones on the creek bottom until they caught an edge, and he pulled himself up the far bank and stood there shaking water streaming from his fur, blood diluting into the runoff and turning the stones at his feet a pale washed-out pink. He stood on that bank for 8 seconds. 8 seconds of absolute stillness in which every system in his body recalibrated, and the question of whether to continue was settled not by a decision, but by the absence of an alternative. There was no alternative. The man was on the tree. The place where help lived was down the mountain. The distance between those two facts was the distance Ranger had left to cover, and nothing else mattered, and nothing else existed. He kept moving. The second creek was wider and faster and deeper. The water was snowmelt from the peaks above, cold enough to numb a human hand in 30 seconds, moving fast enough to roll stones along the bottom with a sound like muffled drums. Ranger hit it without slowing down. His body went under the surface completely. For 2 seconds, he was invisible, submerged in water so cold that it would have stopped the heart of a smaller animal or an animal with less to live for. Then his head broke the surface on the downstream side and his legs found the bottom, and he hauled himself out on the far bank and stood in the dirt with his coat flattened against his body and his one good eye fixed on the tree line ahead, and his jaw clamped shut against the pain that the cold water had amplified to a frequency that resonated in every broken thing inside him. The blood on his fur had been washed away by the creek. For a moment, standing on that bank in the fading light, with his coat slicked flat and the water running off him in streams, he looked almost whole, almost undamaged. The way a building looks undamaged from a distance even when the interior has been gutted by fire. He ran through a meadow where the grass was waist-high on a man, and the ground was soft and uneven, and the footing was treacherous in a way that tested every remaining joint and tendon in his legs. He ran through a stand of aspen, where the white trunks stood like columns in a cathedral, and the leaves overhead shivered in a breeze. He could not feel at ground level, and the sound they made was the sound of 1,000 small hands applauding something that no one had asked them to applaud. He crossed a county 2-lane highway at a dead run. A propane delivery truck missed him by the width of a man's outstretched hand. The driver said later in a statement to a sheriff's deputy who was not supposed to be hearing about any of this, and who filed the statement in a drawer that was never opened again, that he had seen a dog running across the road with what looked like half its side missing, and that the dog had not turned its head to look at the truck, had not flinched at the blast of the horn, had not deviated from its trajectory by so much as an inch. It had just kept going. The way a thing keeps going when it has somewhere to be, and dying, is not on the schedule, and will not be on the schedule until the job is done. The last 3 miles were flat, open ground, sagebrush and gravel, and the long shadows of late afternoon stretching across the desert floor like the fingers of a hand reaching for something it cannot quite touch. This should have been the easiest stretch. Flat ground, no obstacles, no creeks, no dense timber to navigate. But it was here on the flat, with the town visible in the distance as a cluster of low buildings and a single water tower, and the glint of sunlight on the tin roof of the gas station, that Ranger's body began to fail in earnest. His gait shortened. His rear legs, which had been carrying their share of the work through the forest and the creeks and the meadow, began to drag. Not both. The left rear, the one connected to the hip that had taken the brunt of the fall when the rope went around his neck in the clearing and someone had yanked him off his feet. The leg was not broken. It was disconnected. The neural pathway between the brain's command and the muscle's response interrupted by swelling or damage, or the simple exhaustion of a nervous system that had been running an emergency protocol for 11 miles and had finally depleted its reserves. He ran on 3 legs for the last 2 miles. The gait of a 3-legged dog is not a graceful thing. It is a lurching, asymmetric rhythm that puts twice the stress on the remaining legs and forces the spine into a compensatory curve that sends pain signals from every joint and vertebra that is being asked to do work it was not designed to do. Ranger did not adjust for grace. He adjusted for speed. He kept his head low and his one good eye forward, and his 3 functioning legs churning through the sagebrush and the gravel and the last of the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. 11 miles, in a straight line, down a mountain, through forest and water and open ground and the fading light of a day that was ending the way all days end, indifferently, without regard for what is happening beneath it. The shop where Gunnar kept Ranger's bed was dark and locked when the dog arrived. Ranger did not stop there. He circled behind the building, cut through the alley, crossed 2 residential yards where dogs behind fences barked at him, and he did not acknowledge their existence because their existence was not relevant to the task, and he came up the back fence of Mercer's Cigar Bar where the Iron Wolves met on Wednesday nights. It was a Wednesday night. Slade Donovan was in the back room with 5 other patch holders, including a man named Hank Briggs, who had been a combat medic in 2 different wars and who carried a trauma kit in his saddlebag, the way other men carry a phone charger, not because he expected to use it every day, but because the one day he needed it and did not have it would be the day that someone died who did not have to. They were discussing Gunnar. They were discussing him because Gunnar had not shown up for the meeting, and Gunnar Steele did not miss Wednesday meetings. He had not missed one in 11 years. The last time had been the week his wife died, and even then he had showed up the following Wednesday with a face like a sealed envelope, and sat in his chair and said nothing for 3 hours, and that had been his way of grieving, and every man in the room had understood it, and not one of them had said a word about it, because there are some things that do not survive being spoken about, and grief is one of them. The back door of Mercer's had a screen door that they kept latched against the moths and the night air. The screen was aluminum mesh in a wooden frame that had been hanging on the same hinges for 20 years, and had never been tested against anything more forceful than a seasonal windstorm. Ranger hit the screen at full speed. He came through it the way a thrown cinder block comes through a plate glass window, with the sound of wood splintering and metal tearing and a crash that brought every man in the back room out of his chair and reaching for whatever was closest to a weapon. The dog landed on the wooden floor. He tried to complete the movement, tried to get his legs fully under him and stand the way he had always stood when he entered a room, upright and alert and ready. His front legs held, his rear legs did not. They buckled, and he went down on his belly and slid forward across the planks, leaving a dark smear on the wood that started wide and narrowed as his momentum dyed a smear that every man in that room recognized without being told what it was. Hank Briggs was the first one to him. Hank went to his knees beside the dog, the same way he had gone to his knees beside wounded men in places that he would never talk about, in rooms that were not this room. His hands moved with the rapid, practiced efficiency of a man whose hands have performed triage so many times that the process has been transferred from the conscious mind to the motor cortex, freeing the brain to assess while the hands do the work. He saw the wound on the ribs, the long, ugly exposure of bone where the fur and skin had been torn away. He saw the wound on the neck, the round entry point, and the matching exit wound on the other side. The bullet's path a corridor of damage that had, by some miracle of anatomy, passed between the spine and the carotid artery and the trachea without hitting any of them, threading a gap that a surgeon would have needed imaging equipment to find, and that the bullet had found by chance or by something that was not chance, but that did not have a name in any medical textbook. He saw the swollen eye. He saw the bare neck where the collar had been ripped away, and he saw when he reached for the dog's head to check his airway that there was something clamped between Ranger's teeth, a strip of denim roughly 4 inches by 2 inches torn from a vest with enough force to pull the fabric apart at the seam. Sewn onto the denim was a patch. The patch was faded and stained, but the image and the text were legible. It was not the Iron Wolves patch. It was the Splinter Crew patch. Dax Riggs's patch. Slade Donovan looked at the patch. He looked at the dog on the floor. He looked at the blood trail leading from the ruined screen door to the spot where the animal lay. He looked at the 5 men standing around him, and he said one sentence. The sentence was spoken quietly. It was spoken with the kind of certainty that does not need volume, because volume is what uncertain men use to compensate for the doubt they are trying to drown out. And Slade Donovan was not uncertain about anything. He said, "Gunner is on a tree somewhere on that mountain. Get the trucks." They went. 6 trucks, 12 men. They left within 4 minutes. Hank stayed behind with the dog. He laid Ranger on a clean blanket on the floor of the back room and opened his kit and went to work under the overhead light. He worked for 2 hours. He cleaned the wounds with saline and antiseptic. He sutured what could be sutured. He stabilized the cracked ribs with a wrap he fashioned from elastic bandage and strips of medical tape. The bullet wound was through and through clean on both ends, and the structures it had passed between were intact by a margin that Hank later described as not medical, but theological. The dog was dehydrated. He was in shock. His pulse was thread-like and rapid. His body temperature was falling. But his one good eye was open. Through the entire 2 hours of treatment, through the cleaning and the stitching and the wrapping and the needle, the dog did not whine. He did not pull away. He did not attempt to bite the hand that was causing him pain in the process of saving his life. He lay on that blanket on that wooden floor, and he kept his eye open, and he stared at the door. The door was the direction that mattered. The door was the direction his person was in. The job was not finished. Hank told me later, and I am telling you now, that in 2 wars and 30 years of treating men and animals who had been broken by violence, the silence of that dog was the loudest thing he had ever heard in any room he had ever been in. When the bleeding was controlled and the wrap was secure, Ranger got up. He got up on 3 legs because the 4th was no longer accepting commands from the central nervous system. He walked to the back door that he had come through 20 minutes ago, the door with the screen hanging in pieces from the frame, and he stood there facing out, facing the dark, facing the mountain. He had a map to finish. They put him in the cab of the lead truck in the passenger seat next to Slade Donovan. Slade drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the dog's shoulder, not stroking, not comforting, just maintaining contact, the physical language of a man telling an animal that he understood what was happening and that they were going in the same direction and that the going would continue until it was done. The drive up the mountain was 1 hour and 40 minutes. The trucks took the switchbacks in a convoy, headlights cutting through the dark like the eyes of something predatory moving uphill. Ranger sat in the passenger seat with his head turned toward the windshield. Every time the road forked, the dog moved his head, left, right, straight. He did not bark. He did not whine. He leaned. That was all. He leaned in the direction that mattered, and Slade followed the lean, and the 5 trucks behind him followed Slade, and the mountain opened up ahead of them, fork by fork, guided by a dog who had run this route in reverse less than 3 hours ago, on 3 legs, with a bullet hole in his body, and who had stored every turn and every scent marker and every gradient of the terrain in the navigational architecture of a brain that had been designed over 10,000 years of selective breeding to do exactly this kind of work. Nora Keller arrived in town 40 minutes after the trucks had left for the mountain. She pulled her pickup into the gravel lot behind Mercer's cigar bar and found a man she had never met standing in the doorway of the back room with blood on his hands and a kit bag at his feet, and a look on his face that communicated the entire situation without a single word being necessary. The man was Hank Briggs. He looked at Nora for a moment. Then he said, "You are Gunner's daughter." She said yes. "He said they went up after your father about 40 minutes ago. The dog came in here torn to pieces, and he showed us who did it, and then he got back up and he got into the truck, and he is leading them up the mountain right now." "Take me up there," Nora said. Hank did not argue. He did not tell her it was too dangerous. He did not tell her this was club business, and that club business did not include the daughters of members who had been gone for 11 years. He looked at her standing in the doorway of a cigar bar she had not been inside since she was 14 years old, a woman in a flannel shirt and work boots who had driven 400 miles through the night with her father's name in her mouth, like a stone she could not swallow, and he saw something in her face that he recognized, because he had seen it in the faces of men and women who had traveled great distances, under great duress, to reach someone they loved, the look of a person who has already made every decision that matters and is simply waiting for the physical world to stop standing in the way. He said, "Take the county road north. Follow the tire marks. You will see the trucks when you get close. Do not stop for anything." Nora drove. The road went from pavement to gravel to dirt, the way it always did when you went north out of that town, the way it had when she was a child, and her father had taken her up into these mountains on the back of his Harley to show her where the elk came down to the creek to drink in the early morning. She had been 9 years old. She had sat behind him on the wide leather seat with her arms around his waist and her cheek pressed against his jacket, and the vibration of the engine had traveled through his body into hers, and it had felt like a second heartbeat, like the world had two pulses, and one of them was her father's, and as long as she could feel it, she was safe. She had not thought about that ride in 11 years. She was thinking about it now. She was thinking about how his hands had looked on the handlebars, large and scarred and certain, and how she had believed with the total conviction that only a child is capable of that, those hands could fix anything in the world, and that nothing could hurt a man whose hands were that steady. The tire tracks in the dirt were fresh and deep, 6 vehicles moving fast. She followed them up the mountain around switchbacks she remembered from another life past landmarks she had forgotten she knew, a split boulder that looked like a hatchet blade, a pine tree struck by lightning 20 years ago that was still standing, blackened and bare, a monument to the stubbornness of living things. The headlights of her truck bounced off the dust that the convoy had left hanging in the air, and the particles caught the light and turned it gold, and for a moment the road looked like it was made of something precious. She found the trucks parked in a rough cluster at the end of a track that dead-ended at a wall of trees. Men were moving in the overlapping beams of headlights and handheld flashlights, their shadows long and broken on the forest floor. She killed her engine. She got out. She walked into the light. Every man there stopped what he was doing and looked at her. She was not wearing leather. She was not wearing a patch. She was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans and boots meant for Oregon sidewalks, not mountain trails in the dark. She looked like what she was, a woman from a different world who had driven back to the one she came from, because the phone rang at 3:17 in the morning, and the walls she had spent 11 years building came down in the time it took a man to say the words, "Your father and the dog and the mountain." Slade Donovan came forward. He was carrying a bolt cutter the size of a short fence post. His face was gray and drawn beneath the brim of his cap, and there was something in his eyes that Nora recognized without having to think about what it was. She had seen it in the eyes of nurses at her mother's bedside, the look of a person who has seen what is happening to another person and is doing everything in their power to change the outcome, and is not certain the outcome can be changed. He said, "We found him. He is alive. Barely, but alive." "Take me to him," Nora said. They walked down the trail, Slade in front, Nora behind, flashlights cutting white corridors through the darkness. She could smell the forest pine resin and cold earth, and something else underneath both, something metallic and organic, something her body identified before her mind gave it a name. She could hear men talking in low, tight voices ahead. She could hear the sound of metal on metal chain being cut. They came around the last bend, and the beams of 4 flashlights converged on a tree that was wider than anything she had ever seen in a forest. Bolted into its trunk was a chain. The chain was wrapped around a man. The man was her father. His head was on his chest. The tape across his mouth was dark with dried blood. His wrists were raw and split where the chain links had cut through skin into the tissue beneath. His shirt was black with sweat and blood and the cold condensation that had settled on his body in the hours since the sun went down. His knees had given out at some point, and he hung from the chains by his chest and arms. His weight suspended his feet, dragging shallow furrows in the dirt. The chain, the only thing keeping him from lying down, and the lying down, the only thing his body wanted. On the ground 10 feet away were 2 bodies. Neither was moving. One had injuries to the throat that told a story in a language Nora did not need to be fluent in to understand. The other lay face up with wounds that she would learn the full details of later from men who had been there when the dog made the decisions that put them on the ground. A man with a bolt cutter was working the chain. Each cut was a small explosion of sound in the silence, metal screaming against metal, and with each link that gave way, Gunner's body sagged a little further toward the earth. When the last link parted, he came forward like a tree that has been cut through, and Slade was there with both arms open and caught him and lowered him to the ground with a gentleness that did not seem possible in a man his size. They pulled the tape from his mouth. Nora heard her father breathe. She heard him take a breath that sounded like a man breaking the surface of deep water after being under for longer than his lungs could endure, a ragged, desperate, involuntary inhalation that was the body overriding everything else and demanding air. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing the clearing or the men or the flashlights. They were looking at something far away, something internal, something that existed only in the space behind his eyes. His lips moved. He was trying to speak. Slade leaned close, turning his ear to Gunner's mouth, and Nora watched Slade's face and saw it change in a way that told her that whatever her father was saying mattered to him more in that moment than any other word in any other language. He was saying a name, over and over, like a chant, like a litany, like the last word a dying man chooses to spend his final breath on, because it is the only word that means enough to be worth the cost. Ranger, Ranger, Ranger. Slade looked up. He looked toward the lead truck 30 yards away, its passenger door hanging open. Ranger was already coming, on 3 legs, moving across the uneven ground of the clearing with the slow, terrible determination of a creature that has exceeded every limit. Its body was designed to enforce and is now operating on something that biology and medicine do not have a word for, but that anyone who has ever loved anything recognizes immediately when they see it. He came to Gunner. He put his head against Gunner's chest against the spot where the chain had been, as if he was trying to replace one pressure with another, the weight of iron with the weight of his own living skull, the cold of metal with the warmth of an animal who had crossed 11 miles of mountain and forest and his own approaching death to be in this exact place at this exact moment, touching this exact man. Gunner's hand came up. It was free now. The zip ties had been cut. The chain was on the ground in pieces. He laid his hand on the top of Ranger's head, and his fingers curled into the fur behind the dog's ears and held there with a strength that should not have existed in a body that depleted, but did exist because some things do not obey the laws of physiology. Nobody in the clearing spoke. 12 men stood in the beams of flashlights and headlights in a forest, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, and not one of them produced a sound. Some of them were crying. Men with prison records and scar tissue on their knuckles and histories that would not survive being read aloud in a courthouse. They were crying because they were watching something that they did not have the vocabulary to describe, but that they understood in the part of themselves that was older than language and more honest than anything language had ever been able to express. Nora stood 10 feet away. She watched her father hold his dog, and she watched the dog press his shattered body against her father's shattered body, and she felt something break inside her that had needed to break for 11 years. She had hated this world. She had hated the leather, and the patches, and the Wednesday night meetings, and the smell of engine grease and road dust. She had hated it because she had decided that it was the thing that had killed her mother, the lifestyle, the danger, the code that seemed to put brotherhood above family and the road above home. But standing in that clearing, watching a dying dog press his head against a dying man's chest, she understood something she had refused to understand for more than a decade. The thing she had hated was also the thing that had come for him. 6 trucks, 12 men, bolt cutters and flashlights, and a drive up a dark mountain in the middle of the night because one of their own was on a tree somewhere, and there was no discussion needed and no vote required and no hesitation in any of them. And before the trucks, before the men, before any human being had moved a muscle, the dog had come, one animal, loyal past the point of reason, past the point of survival, past every argument that the rational world could make for lying down in the dirt and letting the darkness take him. Nora walked forward. She knelt in the dirt beside her father. She put her hand on his shoulder. He turned his head and looked at her, and for a moment he did not know who she was. His eyes were glazed with pain and cold, and the particular confusion that belongs to a man who was certain he was going to die and has just discovered that he is not and cannot yet reconcile those two realities. Then his eyes cleared, and he saw her, and the sound he made was not a word. It was older than words. It was the sound a human being makes when the person they have been praying for in the dark of their own mind for 11 years is suddenly kneeling beside them in the dirt with tears on her face and a hand on their shoulder, and the prayer has been answered, and the answer is real, and it is here, and it is warm. Dad, Nora said, "I am here." They got Gunnar down the mountain in the bed of Slade's truck, wrapped in blankets, with Nora sitting beside him and Ranger lying across his legs. There was no hospital. A hospital meant questions from people whose job it was to ask questions and whose obligation was to report the answers. Questions meant a sheriff's deputy at the foot of a hospital bed with a notepad asking who had chained a 64-year-old man to a tree in the national forest and who had left 2 bodies in a clearing, and how a dog with a gunshot wound had traveled 11 miles to lead a convoy of 12 men up a mountain in the middle of the night to perform a rescue that no official agency would have sanctioned. They went instead to a house on the outskirts of town that belonged to a woman named Jolene Carver. Jolene had been a trauma nurse for 30 years. She had worked emergency departments in 3 states. She had seen everything that the human body can do to itself and everything that other human bodies can do to it. 10 years before this night, she had lost her son in a way that connected her permanently to the chapter, and that meant she did not ask questions when they brought her work at unusual hours. She had a room in the back of her house that was cleaner than most emergency rooms and better stocked than some rural hospitals. It was the kind of room that exists in every small town where men live outside the law but still need someone to stitch them back together when the law is not available as an option. Jolene worked on Gunnar for 6 hours. Broken ribs, 3 on the left side, 1 on the right. A fractured cheekbone that would heal crooked and give him a permanent asymmetry that made him look, if anything, more like a man you did not want to challenge. A dislocated shoulder that she reduced with a single practiced motion that drew a grunt from behind Gunnar's clenched teeth, but not a scream because screaming was a sound Gunnar had decided years ago was beneath his dignity. Exposure, dehydration, blood loss, and a wrist wound that was going to leave a scar pattern that would look for the rest of his life like he had put his arm into a piece of agricultural machinery and pulled it back out. Hank Briggs worked on Ranger in the next room. The bullet had traveled through the tissue below the spine, entering on one side and exiting on the other in a clean through and through that had missed the spinal cord and the major blood vessels by margins that Hank described not in medical terms, but in the only terms that seemed adequate, which were, the dog decided it was not his time yet, and the bullet listened. The ribs were cracked, but not displaced. The eye was swollen, but not permanently damaged. The shoulder wound was deep and raw, but clean, the kind of wound that heals if you give it time and keep it free of infection. Ranger slept for 2 days. When he woke, he stood up on 3 legs, walked out of the room where he had been treated, walked through the hallway of Jolene Carver's house, walked into the room where Gunnar was lying in a bed with an IV in his arm and bandages around half his body, and lay down on the floor beside the bed. He put his chin on the edge of the mattress. He closed his one good eye. He did not move from that spot for 19 days. Nora watched. She slept in a chair on the other side of her father's bed. She did not leave the room for the first 3 days except to use the bathroom. Jolene brought her food, and she ate it without tasting it, the mechanical consumption of a body that insists on being maintained, while the mind occupying it is somewhere else entirely. She watched her father sleep. She watched the dog watch her father sleep. She watched the slow rise and fall of Gunnar's chest beneath the bandages, and she counted his breaths, the way she had counted them when she was a girl sitting on the carpet beside the couch, while he slept after a long ride, counting to make sure he was still there, still breathing, still alive, because the sound of his breathing was the sound that meant the world was holding together. On the 4th day, Gunnar opened his eyes and looked at her and said her name, just her name, Nora. And the way he said it told her everything about the 11 years of silence, because he did not say it the way a man says a name he has not used in a decade. He said it the way a man says a name he has been saying every single day in the privacy of his own mind, in the dark before sleep. The way you say a word that has become a prayer, and that you are afraid to stop saying, because stopping would mean accepting that the thing you are praying for is never going to happen. She took his hand. It was the first time she had touched her father in 11 years. His hand was rough and scarred and warm, and it closed around hers with a certainty that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with recognition. The way a key fits a lock, it was made for the way a piece of a thing finds the place it was broken from and settles back into alignment. He said, "You came." She said, "The dog came first. I just followed." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The space where a smile would be in a man who had not built a career out of keeping his face still, but it was there, and she saw it, and she held onto it the way she held onto his hand. He said, "I thought you were done with me." She said, "I thought I was too." That conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. It covered more ground than the 11 years of silence had managed to cover with all their empty space. When it was finished, Gunnar closed his eyes and went back to sleep, and Ranger shifted on the floor and placed his paw over Gunnar's ankle, and Nora sat in her chair and cried quietly into the hand that was not holding her father's hand, because she understood finally that leaving had been the easy part, and that the hard part was what she was doing now, which was staying, which was sitting still in a room with a broken man and a broken dog, and letting herself feel the thing she had spent 11 years running from, which was love, which was grief, which was the understanding that the two are the same thing, wearing different clothes, and that you cannot have one without carrying the other for the rest of your life. Gunnar healed. He healed the way men of his generation heal, slowly, badly, in silence, and without complaint. By the 3rd week, he was sitting up in bed. By the 5th week, he was walking to the porch. By the 7th week, he was back in the shop. Ranger healed alongside him. 3 legs at first, then 4 with a stiffness in the left rear that would never fully leave him. The eye opened on day 12, swollen and bloodshot, but functional. The rib wrap came off on day 16. The shoulder wound closed slowly, leaving a scar that ran the length of his side like a road on a map. A road that started in a clearing on a mountain and ended on the wooden floor of a cigar bar, and had been traveled in one direction under conditions that no map could represent. By the 6th week, Gunnar was walking to the end of Jolene's gravel driveway and back once in the morning and once in the evening. Ranger walked beside him, matching his pace, exactly stopping when he stopped standing, when he stood. They had always moved in sync. But now there was something different in the synchronization, a tenderness that had not been there before. The way two damaged things move together when they understand that the damage is shared and that neither of them is going to recover any faster than the other. Nora watched from the porch. She watched her father and his dog walk 30 yards down a driveway and 30 yards back, and she understood that she was watching a man communicate, not with words. Gunnar had never been fluent in words. He communicated in proximity, in presence, in the act of being in the same space as the thing he cared about and refusing to leave that space. It had been how he loved her mother. He had not said the right things. He had not said enough things. He had not been home enough or soft enough or verbal enough for a woman who needed to hear words the way flowers need rain. But he had been there. Every morning of the illness, every treatment, every hospital visit. He had been there with his hands in his pockets and his jaw clenched and his eyes carrying everything his mouth could not. And when her mother died, he stood at the graveside with his hand on the casket and did not move until the last car left the parking lot, and then he stood there for another hour because leaving would have felt like abandoning her, and Gunnar Steele did not abandon the people he loved, even when the people he loved were in a box in the ground. Nora had called it emotional coldness. She had called it his inability to express what he felt. She had called it one of the reasons her mother died with a broken heart. She had been wrong. She had been wrong the way young people are wrong about their parents completely and without malice, with a conviction that takes a decade and a crisis to soften enough for the truth to get through the crust. The truth was simple. Gunnar loved the way a man loves when no one has ever taught him the language for it. He loved in actions. In 11-hour drives and 90 silent nights and a folded vest in a saddlebag and a daughter's name said every morning in the dark. He loved the way the dog loved without words, without explanation, without any of the performance that humans have convinced themselves is necessary to make love real. On the 7th week, Nora drove Gunnar back to the shop. They did not speak during the drive. The radio was off. The windows were down. The morning air came through the cab carrying the smell of sagebrush and gasoline, and the particular kind of dry, open emptiness that Nevada air carries when it has traveled a long distance without touching anything green. The shop was as he had left it. The workbench, the tools in their outlined positions on the pegboard, the sawed-off shotgun still leaning against the back wall where he had left it, the dog's bed in the corner still holding the impression of the body that had slept in it 1,000 nights. Ranger walked in on 4 legs and went directly to his bed and lay down in the impression as if it had been holding his place, which in a way it had. Gunnar stood in the center of his shop. He looked at his tools. He looked at his dog. He looked at the window that had been bricked and replaced. He took a breath that he felt in every broken rib. Then he picked up a wrench and went to work. Because that is what men like Gunnar Steele do when the world has attempted to kill them and the world has failed. They pick up a wrench. They go to work. They let the work say what they cannot. Now, about the rest of it. The 2 bodies in the clearing were handled by men whose job it had been for many years to handle such things. The specifics of the handling are not part of this story. They are part of a different story, a darker one, the kind that is told only between men who have earned the right to hear it by living the kind of life that requires such stories to be told. Neither body was reported missing by anyone whose report would have been investigated. Dax Riggs had been disowned by his own family years before the chapter disowned him. The second man had been hired from out of state and had no local connections that would generate inquiries. The remaining members of the splinter crew presented a smaller problem once the central figure was no longer capable of organizing anyone for any purpose. 2 of them turned themselves in to a federal task force within a month. They understood the arithmetic. The arithmetic said that the Iron Wolves had mobilized 6 trucks and 12 men in the middle of the night based on the testimony of a bleeding dog, and that the alternative to federal custody was becoming part of the darker story that the bodies in the clearing had already joined. The other two left the state and traveled to places that were not Nevada and not anywhere in the vicinity of men who wore Iron Wolves patches. They were not heard from again in any way that mattered. But there was one more thread in the story that had not been resolved, and it was Nora who found it. She found it in the third week of Gunner's recovery while he was still in bed at Jolene's house. She had been going to the shop every day, cleaning, organizing, doing the practical work that a daughter does when she does not know any other way to say, "I am sorry for the 11 years I was not here." She had found Gunner's notebook in the top drawer of the workbench, the one with the license plates and dates and phone numbers that had brought down Dax Riggs. She was not looking for it. She was looking for a rag. But she opened the drawer, and there it was, and she picked it up and opened it and flipped through the pages without intending to pry. Near the back of the notebook was a page that was different from the others. It was not about drug routes or money. It was a list of dates with question marks written next to them. Dates when Gunner had been at specific locations at specific times. Dates that when Nora cross-referenced them with what Slade had told her about the timeline of the ambush corresponded precisely with the information that Dax would have needed in order to know where Gunner would be on the day of the trap. Someone inside the chapter had been feeding Dax information about Gunner's schedule. She brought the notebook to Slade at Mercer's. She laid it on the same table where her father had laid it weeks before. She said the same words. "This is not a conversation I want to have, but it is a conversation we need to have." Slade read the page. He looked at the dates. He looked at the routes. He saw the pattern that he should have seen himself, and had not because he had been too focused on the immediate crisis to examine the infrastructure that had made the crisis possible. His face changed. It did not change dramatically. It changed the way stone changes when a crack appears in it, a small alteration that implies a much larger structural problem beneath the surface. He said, "There is a prospect. His name is Tucker Cole. He is 20 years old. He has been with us for 6 months. He is the only person besides me who knew Gunner's schedule on the day he went up that mountain." "Bring him here," Nora said. Slade looked at her. He said, "Nora, this is chapter business." Nora looked back at him. She said, "My father was chained to a tree for 9 hours because someone inside this chapter gave his schedule to the man who wanted to kill him. That makes it my business. Bring him here." Slade studied her for a long time. Then he nodded. Tucker Cole sat in a chair in the back room of Mercer's cigar bar on a Thursday evening with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the floor. He was 20 years old. He looked younger. He had the thin, underfed frame of a young man who had grown up in a household where meals were not guaranteed, and the things that were guaranteed were not the kind of things a child should have to learn to survive. His knuckles were scarred in a pattern that Nora recognized from her own childhood, the scars of someone who had been hit, and who had learned early that the hitting was not going to stop just because you wanted it to. Nora sat across from him. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She asked him one question. She said, "Did Dax hurt you too?" The boy looked up. His eyes were wet. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "He told me if I did not give him information about where Gunner would be, he would go to my mother's house. He said he knew the address. He said he would burn it down with her inside." Nora sat with that. She sat with the weight of a 20-year-old boy's terror for his mother's safety. She sat with the understanding that the chain around her father's chest had not started in the clearing on the mountain. It had started in a small apartment somewhere in this town where a woman lived alone, and a son who loved her had been told that the price of her safety was someone else's life. Slade was standing against the wall with his arms folded and his face set in the expression of a man who knows what the code demands and is waiting for someone to demand it. In the world Nora grew up in, the code was clear. The boy had betrayed a brother. The boy had nearly gotten a member killed. The consequence for betrayal was not subject to negotiation or appeal or mercy. Nora looked at Slade. She looked at Tucker Cole. She looked at the wall behind the boy's head, the wall where in 3 weeks a piece of logging chain with her father's blood in its grooves would be hung with a small brass plaque beneath it. She made a decision. She said, "He stays." Slade's jaw tightened. He said, "Nora." She said Dax Riggs pointed a gun at this boy's mother and told him to choose between his mother and my father. He chose his mother. I am not going to punish a boy for choosing his mother. I will not do it. Because that is what Dax Riggs would have done. That is what the chain does. It goes around one person and it tightens around another, and it never stops until somebody decides to break it. I am deciding to break it, right now, right here. She looked at Tucker. She said, "You are going to work in my father's shop. You are going to work there every day for as long as it takes. You are going to look him in the eye and tell him what you did and why you did it, and then you are going to let him decide what happens next between the two of you. But the chapter does not touch you. Not today, not ever. Because nobody else dies for what Dax Riggs built. Nobody else carries that chain." The room was quiet for a long time. Slade looked at her. She looked back. And then Slade nodded once the same single nod he had given her father the night Gunnar brought the notebook to the table. It was the nod that meant, "I hear you, and I am going to trust your judgment, and if it goes wrong, it is on both of us." Tucker Cole showed up at Gunnar's shop on the first morning Gunnar was back behind the workbench. He walked through the bay door and stood in front of the man whose schedule he had sold and whose life had almost been the price, and he told him everything. What Dax had threatened, what Tucker had done, what it had cost. He told it without excuses and without pleading and without any attempt to make the telling easier on himself than it deserved to be. Gunnar listened. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely without interruption, without any visible reaction on his face. When the boy was finished, Gunnar was silent for a long time. He looked at Tucker. He looked at the boy's scarred knuckles and his thin frame and his wet eyes and his 20 years of a life that had clearly not been kind to him. Then Gunnar said 4 words. He said, "Hand me the 3/8 socket." That was it. That was the trial. That was the verdict. That was the sentence. Come stand next to me. Pick up a tool. Do the work. Let the work be the language that we speak to each other, because neither of us has the words for what happened, and the work does not require words. The work only requires showing up. Tucker worked in Gunnar's shop for 2 years. He became a full patch holder. He voted at the same table where Nora had argued for his life. And every Wednesday night when the chapter gathered in the back room of Mercer's, Tucker sat in the chair closest to the wall where the chain hung. He never looked away from it. It was his way of remembering, his way of paying what he owed, not to the chapter, not to the code, to the woman who had chosen mercy when the code demanded something else, and who had broken the chain in the only way a chain can be truly broken, by refusing to add another link. Wade Holden and his wife Faye were recovered from where Dax had put them. The chapter paid for the headstones, white granite, clean lines, their names, their dates, and a single line from a hymn that Faye had loved. The service was small. Gunnar stood at the graveside with Ranger on one side and Nora on the other. He held his daughter's hand. It was the second time she had touched him since her return. He did not let go until the service was over and the last person had walked back to the parking lot. The logging chain. The actual chain that had been wrapped around Gunnar's body and bolted to a tree in a clearing 11 miles into the national forest. Slade had it cut into 6 pieces. 1 piece was given to each of the 6 trucks that had driven up the mountain that night. The drivers mounted them in their cabs, or hung them from their rear-view mirrors, or kept them in their glove boxes. Each piece was a fragment of the same story carried in different vehicles by different men who had been part of the same drive up the same mountain on the same night for the same reason. The piece that had been around Gunnar's wrists, the piece with his blood still dark in the grooves of the metal, was mounted on the wall of the back room of Mercer's cigar bar. Above it, on a small brass plaque screwed into the wood with 4 flathead screws, were 3 words. He came back. That was the whole inscription. No name on it, no date, nothing to tell a stranger walking into that room what had happened, or who had been involved, or why a piece of rusted chain was hanging on a wall in a cigar bar in a small town in northern Nevada. Just 3 words for anyone in the chapter who already knew. 3 words that carried the weight of 11 miles and 2 creeks, and a propane truck and a screen door and a bolt cutter, and the sound of a dog's nails on a wooden floor, and every other detail of the story that the words compressed into something small enough to fit on a piece of brass. Nora did not go back to Portland. She had expected to. She had told herself during those first weeks at Jolene's house that she would stay until her father was on his feet, and then she would drive the 400 miles back to her apartment and her job and her life and the careful distance she had maintained between herself and the world that had raised her. But weeks became months, and months became a thing that did not have a name because it was not visiting, and it was not moving back, and it was not any of the categories that exist for the choices people make about where they live and why. It was just being there. The way the workbench was there, the way the tools were there, the way Ranger was there in his patch of sun by the bay door, one ear on the road, the other on Gunner, doing the only job that mattered. She started working in the shop. Nobody asked her to. One morning she picked up a wrench and tightened a bolt that was loose on a frame her father was rebuilding, and he looked at her and said nothing, and she looked at him and said nothing, and the arrangement was established without a single word being exchanged, the way the arrangement between Gunner and Ranger had been established on the 90th night without a word. Some contracts do not need language. They just need 2 people to show up in the same place and start doing the same work. She learned engines. She learned the timing and the torque and the particular harmonic that a Harley produces when every component is aligned and the engine is running the way it was designed to run. She learned it the way Ranger had learned Gunner's roots, not by instruction, but by proximity, by standing close enough to the thing long enough for it to become part of her. She opened the shop for regular business on a Tuesday. She did not put up a new sign. She did not change the name. She just unlocked the bay doors in the morning and locked them at night, and stood behind the workbench and did the work that her father had been doing for decades, and that she had apparently been learning without knowing she was learning it every time she had watched him work as a child. The customers came. They came because the name Steel was on the building, and because word moves through small towns, the way water moves through soil, slowly but comprehensively. And the word was that Gunner's daughter had come home, and that she could do the work, and that the dog was still in the corner, and the shop was still the shop. 6 years passed. Ranger died on a Sunday afternoon in the shop. He was 13 years old, which is a long life for a Belgian Malinois, longer than the actuarial tables give the breed. He died on the floor beside the workbench with his head on Gunner's boot, in the exact spot where he had slept every night for 7 years before the shop got the steel door and the cinder block back room, the spot he had returned to after the mountain, as if none of it had happened, as if the bullet and the miles and the screen door had been a detour, and this was the destination he had been heading toward all along. Gunner and Nora dug the grave under the oak tree behind the shop. They dug it by hand, shovels and silence and the hard, dry Nevada dirt that resisted every stroke and gave ground grudgingly an inch at a time. Neither of them suggested using a machine. Some work has to be done by hand because the labor is part of the meaning, and taking shortcuts would subtract something from the total that cannot be added back. Gunner took the K9 vest from the saddlebag. He unfolded it for the first time since the day he had put it there 7 years ago, clean and pressed and ready for a duty that never came. He laid it across Ranger's body, flat and straight, the way a flag is laid across a casket. He smoothed it with his hands. He smoothed the Velcro and the faded lettering and the nylon that had been woven to stop a knife and that had never been tested against one because the dog wearing it had always been faster than the knife. They filled in the hole. They stood there for a long time. Slade came out at some point. He did not say anything. He stood next to Gunnar, and after a while he put a hand on Gunnar's shoulder and left it there. It was the language they spoke. Presence. Proximity. The hand on the shoulder that says, I am here and I am not leaving, and you do not need to say anything because I already know. When Gunnar finally spoke, he said one sentence. He said he walked 11 miles for me. That was the eulogy. The entire eulogy. 8 words for a dog who had done something that most human beings would not have done, something that the textbooks of veterinary medicine and animal behavior would have classified as impossible if the evidence of it were not hanging on the wall of a cigar bar in a small town in Nevada. 3 more years passed. Nora ran the shop. Gunnar sat in his chair by the workbench and drank coffee and watched her work, and occasionally told her she was holding the torque wrench at the wrong angle, which she was not, but correcting her was his way of participating, and she understood that and did not argue, because arguing would have disrupted the system they had built, and the system worked. And you do not disrupt a system that works just because one of its components is technically incorrect about the angle of a torque wrench. Gunnar died on a Thursday morning. He was 69 years old. His heart stopped while he was checking the timing on a motor that belonged to a man who had ridden with him for 2 decades. The wrench was still in his hand when Nora found him. He had gone down beside the workbench in the spot where Ranger had slept for 1,000 nights, as if even at the end his body had known the right place to land, the place where the dog had been, the place where loyalty had lived. The chapter buried him next to Ranger under the oak tree behind the shop. There is one stone over both of them, Gunnar and Ranger, man and dog. The stone is gray granite, simple, the kind of stone that does not draw attention to itself, but that will be there long after the people who placed it have gone. Above both names, on its own line cut deep enough into the stone that 100 years of rain will not erase it, are 3 words. He came back. Nora kept the shop open. She kept the dog's bed in the corner, even though there was no dog to sleep in it. She kept the shotgun behind the workbench. She kept the piece of chain that Slade had given her, the piece that had been around her father's wrist on a leather cord around her neck. She wore it every day. She wore it the way some people wear a cross or a wedding ring or a photograph of someone they loved, close to the skin, where the weight of it is constant and the meaning of it is private, and the story it carries is too large for any other container. She became the person who told the story. Not to everyone. Not to strangers who wandered into the cigar bar and looked at the chain on the wall and wondered what it meant. But when a new prospect sat down at the table for the first time, and his eyes went to the chain and the plaque, and his face carried the question that every new face carried, Nora was the one who answered it. She told it the way I am telling it to you, from the beginning, with every part that matters and none of the parts that do not. She always started the same way. She always started with the dog, because the story does not begin with a chain on a mountain. It does not begin with a man named Dax Riggs, or a chapter called The Iron Wolves, or a brick through a shop window at 2 a.m. The story begins in a kennel, in a city in a state that nobody names out loud, with a dog lying on a concrete floor, staring at a wall, waiting for a man who is never coming back. And it begins with another man. A different man. A man in a leather vest with engine grease on his hands, who drove 11 hours to pick up a dog he had never met because he heard that the dog was going to be killed for the crime of loving someone too much to stop waiting for them. It begins with 90 nights, and a leather jacket on a concrete floor, and a chin on an ankle in the dark. It begins with the oldest promise there is, the one that does not need words or witnesses or signatures, the one made between two creatures who look at each other across the distance of species and silence and decide without ceremony, without explanation, that where one goes, the other follows. No matter how far the walk, no matter how dark the mountain, no matter what is broken. He came back, and so did she.